There is something unsettling about the ground we walk on. We trust the earth beneath our feet. We trust that the sidewalks we travel, the malls we shop in, the houses we call home, are all built on stable, ordinary soil. But what if that ground is not empty? What if, beneath the concrete, beneath the asphalt and the manicured grass, there are bones? What if the places we live and laugh and work are quietly resting on top of forgotten cemeteries? Cemeteries that were never properly moved, never honored, never remembered? The truth is far darker than most Americans realize. Across the United States, countless black cemeteries have been erased from sight, hidden beneath progress. They were paved over for highways, swallowed by housing projects, covered by schools and playgrounds. Entire communities were built on top of graves, not by accident, but often by deliberate design. And the bones remain, silent yet restless, a reminder of a history that refuses to stay buried. It begins with a simple question. What happens when a society decides certain people do not deserve remembrance? When the lives of the poor, the enslaved, and the marginalized are deemed unworthy of sacred ground? The answer lies in the uneasy silence of these forgotten cemeteries, and in the chilling stories of those who claim the silence is not so empty. After all, the horror in this story is twofold. First, it is historical. The deliberate destruction and desecration of burial grounds that held generations of black men, women, and children. Cemeteries that once held dignity, however modest, were bulldozed, their markers stripped away, their dead consigned to invisibility. Gravestones became paving stones. Coffins were broken apart by the metal teeth of bulldozers. Human remains were left where they lay, sometimes scattered and exposed, sometimes sealed beneath foundations as if they were trash. The second layer of horror is spiritual, a haunting that lingers in whispers and shadows. For centuries, African and African American traditions have taught that the dead must be honored, that the ancestors must be respected, or their spirits will not rest. To disturb a grave is not only to disrespect the dead, it is to invite their anger, their grief, their unrest into the world of the living. In cities like Tampa, New York, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia, the pattern is chillingly consistent. A black cemetery would stand for decades, perhaps centuries, a final resting place for those who had lived through slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. Then, with the push for expansion, the land became valuable. Developers and city leaders would declare the cemetery abandoned or forgotten, and without ceremony, it would be erased. What mattered more, the memories of the dead or the profit of the living? Time and again, profit won. The ground that holds these erased cemeteries is uneasy ground. It is ground that carries memory, pain, and injustice. Walk across it long enough, and you may hear things you cannot explain. Workers digging foundations have reported machinery breaking down, as if the land itself resisted the intrusion. Others speak of finding bones unexpectedly, entire coffins surfacing when the soil was disturbed. And then there are the stories of shadows, of voices, of things seen out of the corner of the eye near these sites. But before we enter into the realm of hauntings, we must sit with the weight of history itself. The very act of burying the dead is one of humanity's most sacred traditions. It is a recognition that even the poorest among us deserve dignity in death. To rip that away is more than vandalism. It is erasure. It is saying that these lives never mattered, that their memory has no place in the landscape of America. Imagine a child in the 1920s, standing beside her grandmother's grave in a black cemetery in Florida. She lays flowers. She remembers the stories told of the struggles her ancestors endured. Now imagine that same ground in the 1950s, bulldozed to make way for public housing. The headstones are gone. The graves are covered. That child, grown into adulthood, comes back to find nothing remains. The cemetery has vanished. swallowed by brick and concrete. And yet, beneath her feet, her grandmother's bones still rest, hidden beneath the foundations of the buildings. His story has repeated across the country, so many times that it is impossible to count them all. Each one carries not only grief, but also a creeping sense of something unnatural. Because cemeteries are not meant to be erased. Graves are not meant to be built upon. And when they are, the living must reckon with what has been done. The chapters ahead will take us deeper into this unsettling truth. We will travel to Tampa, where Zion Cemetery, once the resting place of over 800 African Americans, was buried beneath public housing projects. Its graves lost to time until radar rediscovered them. We will walk through Central Park in New York, where the thriving black community of Seneca Village was torn apart to create a monument to leisure for the wealthy, its burial grounds silenced under manicured lawns. We will stand on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and ask what it means that the nation's most sacred monuments may sit on top of a potter's field where enslaved people were cast into the earth without ceremony. But before those stories, before the names and the places, we must remember what is at stake. These are not just burial sites. They are the resting places of people who lived, suffered, resisted, and endured. To build over them is to try and erase their humanity a second time. It is to commit a haunting act of violence, not only against the dead, but also against the living descendants who carry their memory. And yet, the past resists silence. Again and again, the dead rise up, not literally, but through memory, through discovery, and some say, through restless signs that they have not forgotten what was done to them. Construction projects halted because bones were found. Families shaken by the revelation that their apartment stands above unmarked graves. Paranormal investigators claiming that the air itself changes in these places, heavy with sorrow and anger. The ground beneath us is uneasy. It holds secrets we have not fully faced, secrets we may not want to face. But to walk across this land without acknowledging them is to participate in forgetting, a forgetting that has already gone on too long. This is the story of what lies buried beneath, a story of injustice, erasure, and silence, a story of voices that still cry out, even when muffled by layers of soil and stone. As we step forward into this history, remember this: the dead are not gone. They are still here, just beneath the surface, waiting to be remembered, and perhaps demanding it. The uneasy ground does not forget, and neither should we. History is not only written in books. It is carved into stone, etched into earth, and whispered through the places where the dead lie. Cemeteries are more than final resting places. They are archives of memory, silent libraries of names and dates. Each headstone a reminder that someone lived, someone mattered. But when those cemeteries are stripped away, when stones are taken, when graves are paved over, it is not just the dead who are erased. Entire histories vanish. And in America, few histories have been erased as deliberately and as hauntingly as those belonging to black communities. The erasure began early. In the days of slavery, black people were often denied access to official burial grounds. In many southern cities, enslaved men and women were buried in separate fields, often outside town limits, their graves marked only with wooden crosses or simple stones that decayed quickly over time. These fields were known as potters. Fields, places for the poor, the enslaved, and the forgotten. There was little investment in maintaining them, and when land became valuable, these burial grounds were the first to disappear. After the Civil War, when freed black communities established their own cemeteries, these became sacred places of dignity and remembrance. Families who had been denied the right to honor their dead under slavery finally carved proper headstones, finally laid flowers without fear. These cemeteries were proof of survival, of resilience, of a people reclaiming humanity. Yet, as decades, past, those sacred spaces were systematically targeted. Why? Because cemeteries occupy land, and land is power. By the 20th century, as cities expanded, black cemeteries were often deemed neglected or abandoned, legal terms that gave municipalities justification to seize the land. Developers saw profit where families saw memory. And in nearly every case, the voices of black families were ignored, drowned out by city councils and real estate deals. In Tampa, Florida, the Zion Cemetery was declared abandoned in the early 20th century, despite families still visiting graves. By the 1920s, developers were already eyeing the land for housing projects. Gravestones vanished, removed without care. Some were stolen, some were dumped. By the 1950s, the cemetery had disappeared completely, replaced by housing. Only decades later, through radar scans, would the truth reemerge. More than 800 bodies still lay beneath. This story is not unique. Across the South and North alike, similar patterns repeated. In Houston, Freedman's Town was slowly consumed by urban development, its burial grounds covered by new streets. In Philadelphia, black cemeteries were relocated hastily, often leaving behind remains. In Washington, D.C., the potter's field that once held thousands of black and enslaved bodies now lies beneath some of the nation's most iconic monuments. The language of erasure is always the same. Officials describe the cemeteries as neglected. They call them eyesores. They argue that progress requires sacrifice. But the sacrifice was never equal. Wealthy white cemeteries were protected, preserved, moved with ceremony, if relocation was necessary. Black cemeteries were bulldozed, built over, or forgotten entirely. Gravestones were sometimes used as building material, recycled into sidewalks and seawalls, a grotesque reuse that turned sacred markers into ordinary stone. This practice carried a chilling message. Some lives were considered worthy of eternal rest, while others could be erased for convenience. The graves of enslaved people, freedmen, and their descendants were treated as disposable. And in that act, America wrote its values into the earth, declaring that black memory could be paved over, built upon, hidden beneath. But the earth does not forget so easily. When developers paved over cemeteries, they did not remove every coffin. They did not take every bone. They simply covered them, hoping no one would notice. But time has a way of revealing what was buried. Construction workers digging new foundations often struck wood, bones, or even intact coffins. Some reported feeling unnerved, sensing that they were disturbing something sacred. Others, more coldly, discarded remains as debris. In certain cities, entire communities unknowingly grew up atop these hidden graves. Children played on playgrounds that covered burial grounds. Families slept in apartments that sat directly above long-forgotten coffins. Malls were built where funeral processions once marched. The living carried on, unaware of the dead just beneath their feet. But in many cases, the unease lingered. People spoke of odd sounds, of strange dreams, of shadows moving in places where no shadows should be. This erasure of cemeteries also erased genealogy. For black families, who already faced the loss of ancestral memory due to slavery, cemeteries were one of the few tangible connections to the past. When those cemeteries vanished, entire family histories were severed. Descendants were left unable to trace their lineage, unable to find their ancestors' names, unable to stand at the graves that should have been theirs to visit. This loss was more than physical. It was spiritual. It was as if entire generations had been swallowed into silence. And so the horror of erased cemeteries is not only the image of bulldozers crushing gravestones. It is the knowledge that erasure was intentional. These were not simple accidents of time. They were acts of power. They were choices to prioritize development over dignity, profit over memory, expansion over humanity. And each time, it was black. Communities that paid the price to walk through American cities today is to walk over this buried history. In Tampa, the ground beneath housing projects still holds Zion's dead. In New York, Central Park hides the graves of Seneca Village. In Washington, the mall itself conceals the remains of those who were enslaved. The uneasy ground is everywhere, waiting to be acknowledged. What happens to a society that builds itself on erasure? Some say the consequences are felt in the form of haunting, restless spirits that cannot sleep, strange disturbances that resist explanation. Others say the haunting is not supernatural at all, but psychological, a collective unease born from the unspoken. Knowledge that we are living atop crimes never accounted for. As this story unfolds, we will see both sides. We will see the historical facts of what was erased, and we will hear the chilling whispers of what refuses to be forgotten. Because in the end, erasure is never complete. The dead have a way of reminding the living that they are still here. And when history refuses to honor them, they will rise through memory, through unease, through haunting. These erased cemeteries are not gone. They are waiting just beneath the surface. And the ground, uneasy as it is, will not stay silent forever. Construction crews rarely expect to become archaeologists. Yet in city after city across America, that is exactly what happened. Workers with jackhammers, bulldozers, and backhoes were suddenly confronted with something that brought their projects to a standstill: bones. Human bones, sometimes in fragments, sometimes whole coffins, rotted but still recognizable, bursting open as steel blades ripped through the soil. It is an image both horrifying and shameful: skeletons rising out of the earth, not because of folklore or ghost stories, but because cities had knowingly built on top of cemeteries where black men, women, and children had once been laid to rest. In Philadelphia, the story repeated itself in the 1980s. A construction site near Arch Street began to reveal skeletal remains, hundreds of them stacked layer upon layer. The city was stunned. For years, pedestrians had walked above the site, unaware that beneath their feet lay an entire 18th century burial ground. Though many of the graves belonged to white congregants of a long-gone church, black burials were discovered intermingled, marked by simple coffins, often without headstones. They had been erased from the records, buried in silence, and rediscovered only when disturbed. In New York City, the shock was even greater. In 1991, workers digging the foundation for a new federal office building unearthed something that could no longer be hidden: the African burial ground. At first, officials tried to downplay the discovery, but as the digging continued, nearly 15,000 bodies were found. Many of them bore evidence of brutal lives: bones marked by whippings, teeth filed down in African traditions, skeletons of children who had died before ever reaching adulthood. It was a graveyard the city had paved over centuries earlier, hiding beneath layers of concrete, glass, and steel. The silence was broken. New Yorkers were forced to confront the truth. Wall Street, one of the most powerful financial centers in the world, had been built directly over the resting place of enslaved Africans. But New York was not alone. In Dallas, parking lots covered what was once Freedmen's Cemetery, a resting ground for black residents who had lived and died under the shadow of Jim Crow. Families knew their loved ones had been buried there. Yet by the mid-20th century, the land had been seized and paved. Only when highways were expanded did construction crews begin unearthing bones. The city tried to reinter the remains respectfully, but for many families, the damage was already done. The sacred ground had been desecrated long before. Even in Florida, luxury hotels, shopping centers, and waterfront condos were built atop forgotten black cemeteries. In Tampa and Clearwater, school children were once taught on land that had been Cemeteries only for investigators decades later to discover that hundreds of coffins were still beneath the playgrounds. Some graves had even been moved, but many had simply been ignored. The markers bulldozed away. Each discovery carried the same chilling pattern. Cities grew, money flowed, and those with the least power, the Black Dead, were literally buried and forgotten, their history erased to make way for progress. What unsettled many was not only the fact that the dead had been disturbed, but that their disappearance had been deliberate. Developers and politicians had known. Cemeteries had been listed on maps. Records showed who was buried and where. Yet, when the land became valuable, those records were lost, and the graves vanished from public memory. Imagine walking across a city park, an office plaza, or a luxury apartment building without realizing that beneath the polished concrete and manicured grass lies an entire community of the dead. Men and women who were enslaved, segregated, denied dignity in life, and stripped of it again in death. In some cases, residents reported strange happenings after the discoveries. Workers spoke of eerie feelings, sudden cold winds, and shadows that seemed to move in the half-dug pits where coffins had been exposed. In Dallas, several construction workers swore they heard whispers as they unearthed skeletons. One left this job entirely, claiming he would not be part of digging up the restless. The haunting of these burial grounds isn't only supernatural, it is historical. It's the weight of centuries of injustice pressing back against a society that tried to bury its sins beneath concrete. What became clear was this: these cemeteries had never truly disappeared. They waited, silent and patient, for the moment they would rise again. The air above New Orleans has always carried the scent of water, rot, and something older still, memory itself. By the late 19th century, the city had become a marvel of progress and commerce. But beneath its cobblestone streets and iron balconies lay a truth that builders tried to ignore. The ground was never empty. As neighborhoods expanded, developers faced the problem of space. Cemeteries, especially those belonging to black communities, were considered expendable. In a city plagued by yellow fever outbreaks, officials claimed that removing cemeteries was a matter of public health. Yet the reality was less about disease and more about erasure. Graves of enslaved Africans, free people of color, and the forgotten poor were leveled, their markers torn away. What had once been sacred resting places became the foundations of markets, schools, and rows of elegant houses. But the ground itself refused to be silent. Workers complained of unearthing bones as they dug foundations. Construction stalled as skeletons surfaced, sometimes intact, sometimes shattered into fragments that bore teeth marks of centuries-old violence. Local newspapers occasionally mentioned remains discovered, but the stories were treated as curiosities rather than crimes. After all, in the eyes of city leaders, these weren't the bones of important people. Residents began whispering about strange happenings. Streets paved over burial sites seemed cursed. Homes built atop forgotten graves suffered floods worse than their neighbors, as though the soil resisted anything placed upon it. Families spoke of shadows moving at night, of sounds like distant weeping rising from beneath their floors. Children claimed to dream of strangers staring at them from beneath the ground, faces darkened by time but filled with sorrow. The most chilling tales came from Treme, one of the oldest African-American neighborhoods in the United States. There, generations remembered stories of ancestors whose graves had been lost under the march of urban progress. Spiritual leaders warned that disturbed spirits wandered the city, searching for recognition. These weren't merely ghost stories. They were history asserting itself, demanding to be remembered. One documented case told of a school built over an old burial plot. Teachers reported doors slamming on their own, desks rattling, and the unnerving sound of muffled chanting drifting through the halls. Some dismissed it as superstition, Yet others believe the voices belong to those who had once been enslaved spirits, still crying out, their names long erased. New Orleans was not alone. In cities across America, the same. Pattern repeated. Sacred ground turned into real estate, cemeteries erased with the sweep of a developer's hand. From Richmond to New York, from Florida to Texas, black burial grounds were buried again, this time under concrete, asphalt, and denial. And yet, no matter how much dirt or concrete was poured over them, the bones had a way of returning. Rain, floods, construction projects, again and again, the dead surfaced. It was as if the earth itself refused to let their stories be buried forever. By the dawn of the 20th century, whispers grew into an unspoken truth. American cities were haunted, not by the idea of ghosts in the traditional sense, but by the weight of lives disrespected, by the countless bodies beneath the streets, by the knowledge that entire foundations had been built upon stolen rest. The city above thrived, unaware or unwilling to admit that its very heartbeat pulsed over bones. And in the silence of those disturbed graves, history festered, waiting for someone to listen. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, America was booming with growth. Railroads carved through the land, factories smoked against the skyline, and new neighborhoods rose from the dirt at astonishing speed. But beneath the foundations of these modern marvels, the country had buried more than stone and wood. It had buried memory, dignity, and thousands of black lives that had been laid to rest long before the expansion. In cities like New York, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C., the push for progress often meant erasing what lay inconveniently in the path. Entire cemeteries, particularly those belonging to free and enslaved black communities, were declared abandoned or unused, despite the rows of headstones and the records of lives buried there. Officials justified removals by saying the land was needed for schools, roads, or housing. What they didn't acknowledge was the quiet racial hierarchy beneath those decisions. White cemeteries were typically preserved, moved with care, or compensated. Black cemeteries, meanwhile, were paved over, dismissed as though the lives within them had less weight, less permanence, less claim to memory. One of the most chilling examples lies in Washington, D.C., beneath parts of the National Mall once rested. The Columbian Harmony Cemetery, a historically black burial ground where more than 37,000 individuals were interred. It was considered sacred by the families of freedmen, church leaders, and community builders. Yet in the mid-20th century, the cemetery was dismantled to make room for highways and development. Some remains were reinterred, but thousands were lost or discarded, with caskets unearthed and dumped like debris. To this day, construction crews occasionally dig into human bones near the city's most iconic monuments, disturbing reminder of what lies beneath America's symbols of democracy. That similar stories ripple across the South. In Georgia and Florida, developers often bulldozed over small black graveyards, some belonging to enslaved people on plantations. When homes were built on top, residents later reported unsettling phenomena. Doors that slammed on their own, strange cold drafts, and a sense of being watched. Whether these accounts are paranormal or psychological, they reveal something powerful: the guilt of erasure, manifesting as an unease that seeps through walls and into the people who unknowingly live above the dead. New Orleans, with its swampy terrain and above-ground tombs, holds its own dark legacy. Beyond the grand mausoleums that attract tourists, countless unmarked graves of enslaved Africans were left to vanish in the marsh. As new districts of the city rose, those burial grounds became foundations for warehouses and housing projects. Locals whisper that the restless spirits of those who were never given proper rest haunt the streets, weaving their anguish into the jazz notes and night air of the Crescent City. What makes these buried cemeteries uniquely horrifying is not only the physical disturbance of graves, but the spiritual violence, the denial of remembrance. In African and African American traditions, honoring the dead is not simply cultural. It is spiritual. Ancestors guide the living, protect families, and link generations. To bury them beneath concrete, to strip away their markers, is to sever that chain. It is not just historical injustice. It is, in essence, a haunting built into the architecture of America. Even modern forensic investigations reflect this eerie truth. In Tampa, Florida, archaeologists using ground-penetrating radar uncovered hundreds of lost graves beneath schools and housing complexes. Residents were shaken, learning their bedrooms and classrooms sat atop what were once sacred resting places. One student said, "Every time I walk into class, I feel like someone is already there." The ghosts in the foundations are not only metaphorical, they are literal bones, coffins, and spirits hidden under the city's millions call home today. Progress was built on erasure, and the past has a way of clawing back through the concrete. Construction crews in America's cities have long been haunted by discoveries they were never meant to make. Beneath sidewalks, basements, and subway lines, workers often strike something far older than concrete or steel bones. Human remains, tangled and disordered, surfacing like ghosts when the earth is disturbed. These grim findings tell a story the nation has tried to bury, literally and figuratively. One of the most chilling examples comes from Philadelphia. During the 1980s, when excavation for a parking lot uncovered hundreds of skeletal remains. The bones belonged to enslaved Africans and free black residents from the city's early history. They had been buried in what was once a thriving African burial ground, later paved over and forgotten. Construction workers unearthed fractured skulls, jawbones with teeth intact, and coffins that had collapsed into the soil. For many, the sight was horrifying, but for others, it was a revelation, a physical reminder that beneath the city's polished image lay an older story of black life, death, and erasure. The horror was not only in the discovery, but in the way it was handled. Boxes of bones were collected and stored like relics in basements and university labs, often without ceremony or care. Families of the deceased would never know the names of their ancestors. The anonymity stripped from these remains mirrored the anonymity forced upon enslaved people in life. They were denied individuality in the census, in the marketplace, in history books, and now, even in death. The African burial ground in Lower Manhattan, unearthed in the early 1990s, tells a similar story. Construction workers digging the foundation for a federal office tower uncovered more than 400 bodies, most of them Africans who lived and died in 17th and 18th century New York. Their bones bore traces of brutal lives, broken backs, signs of malnutrition, wrists twisted from physical strain. The government's first instinct was to continue building, to pour concrete over centuries of history. But the outcry from black activists and historians forced the project to stop. For once, the silence of the dead was broken by the voices of the living. Yet, even when unearthed, these bones were not given immediate peace. Researchers examined them under microscopes, measuring skulls, cataloging fractures, and treating them more as scientific specimens than as ancestors. This, too, is a haunting continuation of a long legacy, the medical exploitation of black bodies. From plantation experiments to hospital dissection rooms, black remains have been probed and picked apart in ways rarely endured by white counterparts. The unearthed cemeteries were not just burial grounds, they were crime scenes, evidence of systemic erasure and exploitation. What makes these discoveries even more chilling is the sheer number of them. Across the country, from Georgia to Texas, similar burial grounds have been stumbled upon. Housing developments, schools, and shopping centers sit atop what were once sacred places. Each time the soil is cut open, the past seeps out in fragments of bone and coffin wood. The question is not whether more will be found, But when, and when they are found, they remind us of an unsettling truth. These cemeteries were never really gone. They were always there, silent beneath the footsteps of millions. Every bus stop, every subway platform, every office tower may be standing on ground that once held the dead. The horror lies in knowing that our cities are not just built over graves, they are built over acts of forgetting. The unearthed bones don't just tell us how people died. They remind us of how a nation worked to erase memory itself. But the dead, even when buried under centuries of concrete, do not remain silent forever. By the mid-20th century, American cities had embraced an era of rapid construction highways. Skyscrapers, shopping centers, and public housing projects rose at breakneck speed. But beneath the concrete and steel, an older truth still lingered. The land itself remembered. Every poured foundation, every paved road, was often laid atop displaced histories. And sometimes, those buried histories seemed to push back. One of the most chilling examples can be found in New Orleans, a city whose relationship with the dead is unlike any other. The soft, marshy soil had long forced people to bury their loved ones above ground in elaborate tombs. But on the outskirts, poorer black communities and enslaved Africans were often interred in shallow, unmarked graves. As highways cut through these neighborhoods in the 1960s, countless bones surfaced during construction. Workers reported unearthed coffins splitting open under bulldozer treads, skeletal remains tumbling out like accusations. The official response? Quiet reburials, often in mass pits, with little acknowledgement of who these people were. Locals whispered that the spirits of the forgotten were restless, and strange sightings along the new expressways only seemed to confirm it. But this wasn't unique to New Orleans. In Philadelphia, during the 1980s, a redevelopment project unearthed the remains of hundreds of free and enslaved black people in what was once known as the First African Baptist Church burial ground. Instead of halting construction, city leaders pressed forward. Bones were shoveled into boxes, sometimes mislabeled, sometimes discarded. Residents of the area began reporting unsettling phenomena: cold spots in new apartments, children waking in the night screaming about shadowy figures standing at their bedside, phantom footsteps echoing in freshly built corridors. The past had not vanished. It had been paved over. In New York City, the legacy was even larger. The discovery of the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan during the 1990s forced the nation to confront how casually Black Death had been ignored. For years, construction crews had quietly encountered bones during city projects, only to dispose of them and move on. But when archaeologists finally investigated, the scale of the desecration was horrifying. More than 15,000 bodies, buried and forgotten beneath the financial capital of America. Workers admitted to feeling watched on the site, to hearing whispers and faint cries when the site was disturbed. Some claimed the machinery inexplicably failed, only to resume once the bones were carefully recovered. Patterns began to emerge across the country. Wherever black cemeteries were erased for the sake of progress, strange events followed. In Florida, highway patrol officers spoke of ghostly apparitions darting across Interstate 275 in Tampa, near the former Zion Cemetery. In Georgia, homeowners complained of doors unlocking themselves and furniture shifting in new developments that had covered old slave cemeteries. In Texas, construction workers told of nights when machinery roared to life by itself, or of skeletal hands appearing briefly in the soil before crumbling to dust. Historians argue that the unease people feel in these places comes not from the supernatural, but from guilt, the collective weight of injustice never acknowledged, never atoned for. But others insist that what lingers is real, a haunting tied not just to the dead, but to the way they were treated in death. For if a culture's treatment of its ancestors is a reflection of its soul, then America's soul is scarred with desecration. The unsettling truth is that these are not isolated incidents. They form a mosaic of forgotten cemeteries, covered over by concrete, ignored by developers, erased from maps. And each time bones surface from the ground, they bring with them a reminder. The past cannot be buried forever. The question is not whether these ghosts exist, it is whether we are willing to listen to them. By the 1960s, America was in the middle of an explosive wave of urban development. New highways cut through neighborhoods, skyscrapers rose into the clouds, and modern city planners sold visions of gleaming futures. But what they rarely admitted was the foundation for this progress. Concrete poured directly over the dead. Entire cemeteries, many belonging to Black families, were being erased to make way for a version of America that didn't want to remember its past. In Jacksonville, Florida, the construction of Interstate 95 bulldozed through the historic Black neighborhood of La Villa. Families protested as workers unearthed bones, coffins, and even jewelry, yet officials dismissed the remains as obstacles to progress. In some cases, bodies were hastily moved, but more often than not, they were simply left beneath the road. Even today, commuters drive over a highway that is, in truth, a burial ground. The same pattern appeared in countless cities. In Atlanta, the construction of schools and public housing projects displaced Black cemeteries. Developers gave these places new names: green spaces, recreational fields, but under the manicured grass were bodies never properly reburied. In St. Louis, sections of the once massive Greenwood Cemetery were paved over, leaving thousands of unmarked graves hidden beneath parking lots and strip malls. For Black communities, these acts weren't just erasures of burial sites. They were symbolic of a deeper, more painful truth. Generations of struggle, heritage, and memory were being literally buried under America's desire for expansion. The message was clear. Even in death, their presence could be pushed aside, and yet whispers of resistance always remained. Stories spread of construction workers refusing to continue after hearing unexplained voices at night. Machinery would break down near disturbed graves. In one case in Houston, a bulldozer sank into the ground after collapsing into what turned out to be a forgotten crypt. The workers swore they had heard knocking from beneath the soil. Legends also grew within the neighborhoods that had lived beside these cemeteries for generations. Children dared one another to walk near construction sites at night, claiming to see figures rise from the ground. Elders warned that disturbing the dead would bring curses, sickness, misfortune, even madness. Whether superstition or not, these warnings carried the weight of truth. A city built over the dead could never truly rest. By the 1970s, historians and activists began to fight back, documenting the hidden burial grounds before they disappeared completely. Yet for every cemetery that was saved, dozens more were paved under. To this day, beneath football fields, shopping centers, and highways, the bones of the forgotten remain. And as night falls over these cities, residents often report a chilling sense that the ground itself is alive, that the silence beneath their feet is heavier than stone. It is as if the concrete only barely contains the restless dead, waiting for their stories to be told again. Cities thrive on constant noise, honking cars, late-night music, trains rattling underground. Yet beneath that hum of modern life, there are quieter sounds, ones that don't belong in the living world. Across America, there are stories of cemeteries, left under malls, highways, and housing developments where the dead have refused to be forgotten. These are not mere urban legends. They are accounts preserved by residents, journalists, and even city workers who have stumbled across the undeniable evidence that something rests just below their feet. Take New Orleans, a city synonymous with death and haunting. Though its cemeteries above ground draw tourists, The more chilling history lies in those forgotten below the city's development. After floods displaced graveyards, coffins often floated into neighborhoods. Families reported bones washing up in their backyards, turning everyday life into a reminder of a past that would not stay buried. Local lore tells of people hearing, scratching under floorboards, or waking to see shadowy figures pacing across their living rooms. These were not simply ghost stories. They were echoes of a city literally layered upon the dead. Then there's Washington, D.C. For years, residents of Capitol Hill whispered about strange voices and cold winds sweeping through basements. When redevelopment projects began, workers unearthed hundreds of bones tied to long-forgotten African-American burial grounds. Some contractors refused to continue, unnerved by the uncanny chill that settled over the site after dusk. Those who did press forward reported their equipment mysteriously breaking down, as though the very ground resisted their intrusion. In Georgia, where the 1803 Igbo landing tragedy occurred, entire neighborhoods now sit on lands where enslaved Africans were buried without markers. Oral tradition among descendants insists that spirits still roam, restless because their bodies were hidden and disrespected. Locals describe eerie drumming sounds on windless nights, or apparitions dressed in torn garments seen drifting across roads. Many avoid the area after dark, convinced that it is cursed. What unites all of these accounts is the same unsettling truth. You cannot build a future on the erased past without consequences. Developers might have cleared land for profit, but the bones did not vanish. They remained deep in the soil, silent but powerful. And when ignored, they seemed to find ways to make their presence felt. Urban legends often get dismissed as imagination. But in these cities, historical records validate the unsettling claims. Newspapers from the 19th century documented human remains surfacing during floods. Excavation reports from the 20th century cataloged coffins discovered under parking lots and subway tunnels. And in the 21st century, lawsuits filed by descendants of those buried revealed that city planners knew they were building atop sacred ground and chose to do so anyway. The result is more than haunting. It is a wound that lingers. For many African American families, knowing their ancestors were paved over is an ongoing trauma. Graves were not simply forgotten, they were deliberately erased. The land became haunted not just by spirits, but by history itself, demanding to be acknowledged. Some residents claim that once awareness spreads, the hauntings quiet down, almost as if the dead only wanted their names spoken again. Activists have fought to erect memorials, restore cemetery boundaries, or at least place plaques to acknowledge what lies beneath. In some cases, the eerie disturbances ceased after a ceremony of remembrance. But where silence persists, the strangeness continues. Doors slamming shut in abandoned schools, elevators running on their own in office towers, voices whispering in subway tunnels at midnight. The story of America's buried cemeteries is not simply about bones and soil. It is about how cities choose to remember or erase the people who came before. It is about how the dead remind the living that they cannot be silenced, not when their foundations are literally built upon them. And as more construction pushes deeper into the forgotten layers of America's cities, the question lingers: how? Many more unmarked graves lie waiting to be disturbed? And what will happen when they are? By the turn of the 21st century, America's relationship with its buried dead had become more complicated than ever. Urban growth was relentless, skylines expanding, highways spreading, entire neighborhoods rising where forests and fields once stood. But beneath the steel and glass, beneath the asphalt and concrete, the past refused to stay buried. Every construction project, every renovation, seemed to unearth another reminder of what had been hidden for centuries. And often, those reminders weren't just fragments of pottery or traces of old foundations. They were human remains, The cemeteries under America's cities were not simply burial grounds. They were repositories of history, memory, and trauma. Yet the stories they held remained fragmented, scattered like bones, waiting to be pieced together. In many cases, the graves belonged to people who had no voice in life-enslaved men and women, immigrants without money, the poor who could not afford marked stones. To discover them centuries later, in silence, was to face a haunting truth. America had built its future on their forgotten bodies. Scholars and activists began connecting these discoveries, painting a broader picture of just how widespread the phenomenon was. Reports revealed that dozens of major American cities, including New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, and countless others, were built upon old cemeteries. Sometimes these were churchyards left behind when congregations moved. Sometimes they were potters' fields, places where the indigent were buried without ceremony. Other times they were African burial grounds, long erased from official maps to make way for progress. What made the truth even more chilling was the realization that this wasn't just an accidental oversight. In many cases, city officials had knowingly built over cemeteries, treating the dead as obstacles rather than ancestors. Developers paved streets, dug subway tunnels, and raised skyscrapers without fully relocating the bodies beneath. The logic was simple. The living needed space, and the dead, especially if they were poor or black, did not have the same claim to dignity. Communities, however, began to resist this logic. Descendants of the displaced dead demanded accountability, asking why the bones of their ancestors had been hidden, scattered, or discarded. Protests grew louder as people insisted that cemeteries should not be treated as expendable. In New York, activists fought to preserve the African burial ground as a national monument. In Washington, D.C., preservationists demanded respect for the forgotten graves under Walter Pierce Park. In Richmond, local groups worked tirelessly to reclaim Shockoe Bottom, once a burial ground for enslaved Africans and one of the busiest slave trading districts in the country. But for every victory, there were countless losses. Many cemeteries were too thoroughly destroyed to ever be restored. Construction had ground up coffins into dust, reduced bones to fragments, and scattered remains beneath layers of concrete. Even when remains were recovered, they were often boxed up, stored in university archives, or reburied in mass graves without markers. The question lingered: could true justice ever be achieved for the dead when their very resting places had been erased? The horror of this history wasn't only in the disrespect shown to the bodies. It was in the silence that followed, the decades during which people lived, worked, and played above the graves without knowing they were there. Children played on playgrounds that covered cemeteries. Families gathered in parks built over old burial grounds. Shoppers filled malls that had once been graveyards. And only when bones surfaced washed up by erosion or pulled from the ground by construction did the truth emerge. This revelation gave an eerie quality to the urban landscape. How many cities carried hidden layers of death? How many foundations sat atop forgotten coffins? How many streets followed paths once lined with tombstones? In many ways, the whole country had become a palimpsest, a surface written over again and again, while faint traces of the original text remained underneath. America's story of progress was written in steel and stone, but underneath, the faint writing of the dead still lingered. For descendants, this was not just an archaeological question, it was personal. To discover that a loved one's grave had been built over, paved across, or forgotten was to feel an irreparable wound. It was to learn that not only had their ancestors endured hardship in life, but that even in death they had been denied peace. By the late 2000s, a movement for cemetery justice had begun to grow. Advocates demanded full documentation of burial grounds, better preservation laws, and memorials for forgotten cemeteries. They argued that cities should not continue expanding without recognizing the dead beneath their feet. And while progress was slow, the awareness spread. More people began asking questions. What lay beneath their neighborhoods, their schools, their highways? The truth was both unsettling and undeniable. America's urban spaces were haunted, not by ghosts in the traditional sense, but by the weight of history. Every step across certain city blocks was a step across unmarked graves. Every new building stood on ground where lives had ended, where stories had been buried. And so, the cemeteries beneath American cities remain a quiet, persistent reminder. They remind us that the past cannot be so easily erased. They remind us that progress often carries a cost, one measured not just in dollars or time, but in bones and memories. They remind us that, until the dead are given dignity, the living will always walk in their shadow. For some, this realization is eerie haunting, even. For others, it is a call to action. Either way, the message is clear. Beneath the shining surfaces of America's cities lies another country entirely, a country of the forgotten dead, waiting to be acknowledged. The modern world rarely pauses to wonder what lies beneath its feet. Skyscrapers rise, highways roar with traffic, and glass-fronted apartments gleam against the night sky. Yet beneath the polished surfaces of American cities, the past remains. Restless. The ground below is not just dirt and stone. It is layered with memory, injustice, and the quiet persistence of the dead, the burial grounds of enslaved men, women, and children, their lives erased from records, but not from the soil, continue to push against the foundations of progress. In places like New York's financial district, where Wall Street towers glitter, archaeologists unearthed skeletons bent by forced labor, their bones scarred from lifetimes of exploitation. The African burial ground became a reminder that beneath America's wealth lies the unpaid toil of those who never found peace in life, nor dignity in death. But New York was not alone. Cities across the nation repeated the same cycle of forgetting. In New Orleans, paved streets run over colonial graveyards. In Richmond, slave cemeteries were flattened to make way for factories. In Washington, D.C., construction of schools and offices swallowed graveyards where black children once lay. Each act of progress layered another silence over the truth. Makes these stories haunting is not only the physical burial of cemeteries, it is the deliberate erasure of memory. Grave markers were removed, church records lost, headstones recycled as building material. The names of the dead, once spoken by loved ones, were deliberately pushed into obscurity, as though remembrance itself were too inconvenient for the march of the living. Yet history has a way of rising. Heavy rains loosen the earth. Construction. Projects dig too deep. Workers stumble upon skulls, ribs, or the brittle fragments of coffins. And with each discovery, the dead remind the living of what was taken from them. Sometimes, entire projects are halted, forcing developers to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that their shining glass towers stand atop human suffering. Even today, communities fight to reclaim these burial grounds. Descendants of the forgotten gather, insisting that the bones beneath the asphalt are not relics, they are family. They are grandmothers who sang spirituals, fathers who endured chains, children who never saw adulthood. These graves may be hidden, but they are not gone. The horror is not only in the ghosts that might walk the streets at night. It is in the weight of silence carried by entire cities. Millions step across sidewalks, unaware of the human remains. Just below, apartment residents sleep in rooms built on top of cemeteries. Cars speed over highways laid across burial grounds. The living and the dead exist in layers, separated only by concrete. And perhaps that is why some places feel heavy. Why certain corners of cities seem unnervingly still at night. The past has not been buried deep enough. It waits, pressing upward. until someone remembers. The cemeteries beneath America's cities are not just remnants of the past, they are living indictments. They remind us that progress often came at the cost of erasure, that comfort was built on silence, that the dead were treated as obstacles rather than ancestors. But as each hidden graveyard is rediscovered, as each name is spoken aloud again, memory begins to shift. The horror of forgetting becomes the possibility of acknowledgement. The act of remembrance is its own form of haunting, forcing the living to look back, to face what has been paved over, and to accept that history is never truly gone, because in the end, the earth does not forget. It holds everything, every body, every injustice, every silence. And whether through uncovered bones, whispered legends, or the quiet heaviness of haunted ground, the truth will always find its way back to the surface, beneath the shining cities. Of America lies another city, a city of the dead, forgotten, buried, but never gone. And one day, whether we are ready or not, they will all be remembered.